Once upon a time, there was a stretch of West African coast where thunder rolls off the mountains and sounds, if you stretch your imagination a little, almost like a roar. Well, a sailor named Pedro de Centra heard it in 1462, and so he named the whole range after it, Serra Leoa, Lion Mountains. But here's the funny thing, he wasn't the first person here. Not even close. So let's travel back in time, shall we? Long before de Sintra showed up, groups from the African interior had already pushed toward this coastline and settled in, tucked between the mountains on one side and the ocean on the other. The Liembas got there first, as far as anyone can tell. Then came the Boulom, the Temne, and then Mande-speaking peoples like the Vai, the Loco, and the Mende. The dense rainforest kept the region a little cut off from its neighbours, which meant these groups built something pretty distinct here, which was largely on their own terms. Well, that didn't last very long, because it all changed the moment Europeans figured out there was money in it. First it was barter. Then, by 1495, Portuguese traders had built a fortified post on the coast, and the Dutch, English and French all followed with posts of their own. And then the story turned ugly. Fast. Those posts stopped trading goods and instead started trading people. By 1672, the British had forts on Bunce and York Islands. Bunce Island, in particular, became one of the busiest departure points on the entire coast for the transatlantic slave trade. Imagine thousands of people who'd never seen an ocean were suddenly marched onto ships bound for it. For decades, that was the status quo. But as the horrors of the trade started sparking outrage back in Britain, abolitionists began pushing hard for an end to it. Then came a major turning point, the American Revolutionary War. Britain promised freedom to enslaved black Americans who fought for the crown. But after losing the war, Britain suddenly found itself with thousands of Black Loyalists it didn't know what to do with, scattered across London, Canada, and the Caribbean. That's when British philanthropists saw a chance to pivot from destruction to an experiment. Settle those freed people right back on the African coast. Call it the Province of Freedom. The first attempt in 1787 fell apart after clashes with local chiefs and was eventually burned down. The second attempt was a different story. In 1792, nearly 1,200 Black Loyalists made the crossing from Nova Scotia, where they'd been enduring brutal winters and open racism, and built Freetown. By 1808, it became official. It became a British Crown colony. And once slavery was abolished across the empire, the Royal Navy started using Freetown as a base for intercepting illegal slave ships and releasing the people on board, right there in the city. Because of this, Freetown grew into something remarkable. Fourah Bay College opened in 1827, the first institution of higher education south of the Sahara, and English-speaking Africans came from across the continent to study medicine, law, basically, whatever they could. That's why people started calling it the Athens of West Africa. Not bad for a settlement that almost didn't survive, right? In 1896, Britain pushed further inland and declared a protectorate over the surrounding hinterland, folding the coast and the interior into one colonial territory. That held until April 27th, 1961, when Sierra Leone became independent. But if you've watched enough history lessons, you should know that independence didn't mean stability. There was a coup in 1967 that knocked Shaka Stevens out before he'd barely started, though he was back within a year and eventually became president of the new republic in 1971. And then, in 1991, came the decade nobody in Sierra Leone talks about lightly. A former corporal named Foday Sanko formed the Revolutionary United Front and started seizing towns near the Liberian border. What followed was 11 years of coup, counter-coups, and a war brutal enough that by 2000, UN peacekeepers themselves were being taken hostage, and Britain was sending paratroopers just to evacuate its own citizens. The war ended in 2002, and Sanko died in 2003. The country held its first local elections in over 30 years, in 2004, then spent the next decade rebuilding, only to get hit by an Ebola outbreak in 2014 that killed more than 11,000 people region-wide before it finally let go in 2016. So by the time you get to today, you're looking at a country that has been named by outsiders, mapped by outsiders, and caught in external power struggles about as many times as it's ever gotten to write its own destiny. But okay, what does this place actually look like once you get past the history books? Well, the first thing you'll notice right here. is that Sierra Leone is shaped almost like a perfect circle. It's sitting right on West Africa's coast, just a few degrees north of the equator, spanning about 29,925 square miles, or about 77,540 square kilometres. And around it you've got Guinea in the north and east, Liberia in the southeast, and the Atlantic everywhere else. Now I want you to pay attention here and follow that coastline. If you look closely, nearly 250 miles of it, or about 400 kilometres, is made of mangrove swamps, tidal creeks and sandbars. I know it's not looking super glamorous right now, but stay with me. Because once we hit the Freetown peninsula, it's like a whole other world. Just look at this. Mountains erupting out of the swamp and marching straight into the ocean. Among them there's Picket Hill, which tops out around 2,900 feet, or 880 metres. And the best part about it, it stares down over one of the biggest natural harbours on the planet, which is, fun fact, the exact spot that made a Portuguese sailor stop his ship in 1462 and go home, only to tell the tale. Now we have a better understanding of where he was coming from. But you and I both know that hearing about it is so much different than seeing it with your own eyes. And honestly, being in the same place where history happened is the best way you can really appreciate it. So I encourage you to check out the flight deals I've linked in the description below. In the meantime, allow me to tell you more about this country, because there's still so much you don't know. For one, did you know that up north is where you'll encounter the bauxite lands? It's a land that turns into a swamp every rainy season and hardens into something like pavement for the rest of the year. Then down south, the land rolls and green plains stretch out until hills just show up, seemingly out of nowhere. And way out east, you're suddenly in real mountain territory. Check this out. This is Mount Temne. It towers over all of the granite and veins of mineral rock running through it, making it Sierra Leone's highest peak. But it's got a lot more to offer than just height, because at its base you'll find nothing short of treasure. Gold, diamonds, bauxite, rutile. Which, as you'll learn in a second, is what will drive this country's economy, though it might not be what you expect. Because picture the money in your wallet actually losing value while you're holding it. That's basically what's been happening in Sierra Leone, and the mechanism behind it is almost too simple. Between 2017 and 2025, the country's money supply grew by about 22.6% a year. The actual economy, though, the stuff being produced and sold, only grew by 4.1% a year. I want you to think about that for a second. They were producing the same amount of goods, but the money was chasing it 5 times more, which meant prices had nowhere to go but up. So here's what happened. In 2023 alone, inflation hit 47.6%, and over the whole period, prices practically quadrupled. And that's not the worst of it. Because despite that, the real GDP per person only grew by 17% over 9 years. Almost none of that flood of new money translated into prosperity. What it translated into was higher price tags, which is actually why Sierra Leone's debt tells a similar story. See, government borrowing jumped from about 19 trillion leones in 2017 to nearly 79 trillion in 2025, growing almost 20% a year. Fair enough, borrowing isn't automatically bad if it actually builds something, like roads, power, or schools. But in this case, only about 40 out of every 100 leones borrowed went into those types of investments. The other 60 covered salaries, routine costs, or gaps that needed patching. So in 2017 and 2021, new borrowing outpaced new investment by 9 or 10 to 1, which is not looking the best. On the bright side, it's not all bad. Because remember about the treasure underneath Sierra Leone's ground? Let's talk about it. Diamonds are the resource that practically built this country's reputation, and on numerous occasions, funded a war over who got to control it. Granted, production has slowed as the deposits got depleted, but diamonds still remain the country's most recognisable export. Then there's rutile, a titanium ore used in everything from paint to aerospace parts. Compared to diamonds, this one's actually expanding. Not to mention recent Chinese investment has put fresh money behind digging up some bauxite, which is where aluminum ore comes from. Add gold and iron ore into the mix and you've got a country that can almost run on its subsoil. Key word here is almost, because mining only generates about 15 to 20% of the entire country's GDP and 60 to 70% of everything Sierra Leone sells to the rest of the world. Don't worry, they're still figuring out a way to keep evolving their mineral industry and position themselves, at least on paper, as a major supplier. So while we wait for that part of the story to unfold, let's take a quick peek at what everyday life looks like for everyday people. I'll tell you right now, it looks a lot different than what you or I are used to. Because on a regular morning in the Sierra Leone, there's no Wi-Fi buzzing, no traffic app rerouting anyone. It's just a typical village waking up to farm and fish, while the rest of the family is always within close range. Which, come to think of it, explains a lot actually. In Sierra Leone, there are more than 16 ethnic groups. You've got Temnes, Mendes, Limbas, Creos, to name a few. And you'd think with this many people, there'd be friction. But all you get is harmony. Just look at the way they communicate. They use Creole, which is a language born from freed slaves returning home after abolition. It's now spoken as the common tongue among all the groups. Same goes for religion. Around 78% are Muslim and about 20% are Christian. But despite the difference, kids learn both sets of prayers in school, and you'll see God Bless Islam painted right on a bus covered in Christian imagery. While some of us might do a double take at that, seeing that level of tolerance is not at all strange to the locals. It's just part of everyday life to them. Which explains why nothing here really happens solo. Rice and plasters get cooked in batches big enough for whoever wanders by. Palm wine gets tapped fresh off a tree and shared down the road before it even reaches the top shelf. Music spills out of a poda poda, one of their iconic hand-painted shared minibuses, into the street and just as easily pulls a stranger into the rhythm, because it wasn't really built for headphones. All that is to say, Sierra Leoneans are a communal group of people. They value family, yes, but family to them doesn't just stop at blood relatives. It covers the neighbour, the market seller, even the guy who shares his palm wine. Needless to say, Sierra Leone has a lot of surprises up its sleeve, and we've only scratched the surface. So, if you enjoyed this video, you'll definitely love this next one.